Okay, Mario, we discuss oral traditions. What is your opinion on this subject?
Hi Robert, nice to meet you again in these distant talks. Oral traditions, yeah, I had different feelings towards that, especially after I tried to connect oral traditions with historical facts, especially in my studying of Christianity and finding out what is true, what is not true, what is story, what is history, what is something. So, in short, of course, that oral traditions, especially before, had quite important part or stand in transferring knowledge or experiences, traditions, of course, cultural norms, of course, through societies before, especially before starting to write it down and inventing the scripts and all those things. Before, I considered all oral knowledge I acquired from my family or my parents or my teachers, I consider them as truth. Like, that's how they said. However, over time, I saw that in my current life, many stories have changed over time. As I'm getting older, I can clearly see how some stories have changed, which I know now how they were, how they have been changing over time, over last, let's say, few decades. So in Christianity, at that time, I will just focus on few things in Christianity. That is very obvious in the way how different gospels, which were not written by disciples, they were written later, how different gospels describe same point of time or same thing, same event in different ways. Was the tomb open? How many people went there? Who was Mary Magdalene? And all those things. At that time, I started to doubt in accuracy of oral traditions and their connection with historical events. Of course, that is very important, in my opinion. Of course, oral accuracy is very important when you try to talk about events which influenced us, or if you want to convey some knowledge which should be based on facts or historical events or whatever. Of course, in cultural context, it's not so important to the oral tradition be accurate to the letter, I've read that some cultures have developed rigorous techniques to preserve their stories quite accurately, but that is also, I doubt that even they had their technique and the ways how to preserve the context. I believe there was also distortion. Those stories were also distorted over time. And as I said, it's not so important to convey cultural norms so precisely, but of course in religions or other historical events, that's quite important. So, in my opinion, to conclude this will be quite short this time from my side. I see oral traditions as I like to see them like in conjunction with historical evidences. such as artifacts, excavations, or some ancient scripts. I like to see them as giving the context to the physical evidences, but I strongly doubt they can be the only reliable source of truth, quote unquote. There is no truth, even if you have historical artifacts with oral tradition context. It's very hard to actually understand how societies worked 1,000 years ago. Even if you know, let's say, people who had first-hand experiences, you can see how their description changes over time. Even in your life, probably your mother never told you the same story the same way. So imagine if you need to describe things through the generations, and how much that can change. So to conclude, my only only way to handle oral traditions is to keep my eyes open, never stop researching, and that can definitely help to lessen the noise included in oral traditions, but we will never know the truth which was at the moment, maybe back in time, a long time ago. So that's my opinion. What's your stand on this topic?
Oral traditions are very important in Judaism. In fact, there is no Judaism without oral traditions. So in his brilliant essay, The Foundation of the Noahide Code, the Written Torah and the Oral Torah, Rabbi Yaakov Emanuel Shochet explains why it is impossible to follow the written Torah only. Why is it impossible? Practically all of the precepts, the commandments and prohibitions, appear non-understandable. Their practical applications are neither defined nor explained in the text. Consider, for example, these Jewish commandments. There is a commandment of circumcision, but one will not find an explanation in the written Torah of what circumcision means, the where, what, and how. Likewise, there is a prohibition of working on the Sabbath, but there is no definition as to what constitutes forbidden tasks. There are commandments of fringes on four-cornered garments and phylacteries placed on hand and head, but there is no explanation of how these are to be produced or how they are to be worn. There is also a mandate of ritual slaughter that renders kosher species of animals permissible for Jewish consumption, but there are no instructions in the written Torah for how this is to be performed. In fact, Deuteronomy 12:21 states, "Slaughter as I have commanded you," yet nowhere in the written Torah do we find the details of that command. Moreover, the current division of the Pentateuch into chapters is a very late, medieval, and non-Jewish innovation. This chapter division is often blatantly inconsistent with the actual text. The fact that these divisions have become accepted universally is no more than a practical convenience for purposes of reference. The original text to this day in Old Torah scrolls is divided only into two kinds of sections or paragraphs, but without any written punctuation to separate the 5,845 verses from one another. Also, this is critically important, the Hebrew text consists of consonants only. There are no written vowels, and words without vowels are clearly ambiguous. They could be read in many different ways with altogether differing meanings. It follows that even with the acceptance of the Mosaic origin of the Torah, the written Hebrew text before us is altogether incomprehensible. On the other hand, as the Torah has always been the primary text for knowing and practicing God's teachings and commandments, from the very days of its composition, it is clear that the Jewish people must have been informed from the outset as to how to read it, the meanings of its statements and the definitions of its precepts. How so? By an oral tradition. This tradition was revealed to Moses and transmitted by him to the nation, and thereafter passed on from generation to generation. It is called the Oral Torah, and it was specifically not recorded in formal written texts until much later, in the Talmudic and Midrashic writings. Now, in the introduction to the Mishneh Torah, Maimonides gives a list of these receivers of the Oral Torah. And I will actually take the time to list those receivers. So these are their specific names. Rav Ashi received the tradition from Rava. Rava received the tradition from Rabba. Rabba received the tradition from Rav Huna. Rav Huna received the tradition from Rabbi Yochanan, Rav, and Shmuel. Rabbi Yochanan, Rav, and Shmuel received the tradition from Rabbeinu HaKadosh. Rabbeinu HaKadosh received the tradition from Rabbi Shimon, his father. Rabbi Shimon received the tradition from Rabban Gamliel, his father. Rabban Gamliel received the tradition from Rabban Shimon, his father. Rabban Shimon received the tradition from Rabban Gamliel, the elder, his father. Rabban Gamliel, the elder, received the tradition from Rabban Shimon, his father. Rabban Shimon received the tradition from Hillel, his father, and Shammai. Hillel and Shammai received the tradition from Shemaiah and Avtalion. Shemaiah and Avtalion received the tradition from Yehuda and Shimon ben Shattach. Yehuda and Shimon received the tradition from Yehoshua ben Perahia and Nitai of Arbel. Yehoshua and Nitai received the tradition from Yosef ben Yoezer and Yosef ben Yohanan. Yosef ben Yoezer and Yosef ben Yohanan received the tradition from Antigonus. Antigonus received the tradition from Shimon the Just. Shimon the Just received the tradition from Ezra. Ezra received the tradition from Baruch. Baruch received the tradition from Jeremiah. Jeremiah received the tradition from Zephaniah. Zephaniah received the tradition from Habakkuk. Habakkuk received the tradition from Nahum. Nahum received the tradition from Yoel. Yoel received the tradition from Micha. Micha received the tradition from Isaiah. Isaiah received the tradition from Amos. Amos received the tradition from Hoshea. Hoshea received the tradition from Zechariah. Zechariah received the tradition from Jehoiada. Jehoiada received the tradition from Elisha. Elisha received the tradition from Elijah. Elijah received the tradition from Achiah. Achiah received the tradition from David. David received the tradition from Shmuel. Shmuel received the tradition from Eli. Eli received the tradition from Pinchas. Pinchas received the tradition from Joshua. Joshua received the tradition from Moses, our teacher. And finally, Moses, our teacher, received the tradition from the Almighty. So I believe this incredibly specific and incredibly detailed list raises the Jewish oral Torah from mere myth and from mere, folk stories to an actual historical fact. I believe this kind of detailed historical list is impossible to sell to the whole Jewish nation unless the nation actually agreed with the list and with its historical accuracy. And this list, as I mentioned, appears in Maimonides. However, it also appears much, much earlier in the Talmud. So the Talmud itself in tractate Avot and the Ethics of the Fathers gives a very similar list to this, tracing the conclusions of these rulings back to Moses at Mount Sinai. So the reason why Maimonides wrote this in the introduction to his Mishneh Torah is because he wanted the readers to understand this point. His rulings and his codifications, according to him, are not only his subjective opinion, they are actually part of a tradition which goes specifically all the way back to Moses at Mount Sinai. And I think this is a crucial piece of information which is absent from the Gentile world. Very, very few Gentiles know about the existence of the oral Torah and about the existence of this detailed historical tradition of its transmission. So that is the importance of oral tradition in Judaism. As I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation, there is no Judaism without this oral Torah. Throughout history, there were only 2 Jewish sects which rejected the oral Torah, and they were literally sects, meaning they were fringe sects that were rejected by the vast majority of the Jewish people. The first one were the Sadducees, and the second one were the Karaites. So those are the only 2 Jewish groups in history which tried to follow only the written Torah. But even they developed their own subjective oral traditions outside the mainstream Jewish traditions, which go back to Moses. Just very shortly, I also want to, outside the Jewish context, I also want to share an example of Croatian oral literature, and I will recite a Croatian oral poem. Just a second. So it goes like this. Poletjelo jato golubova preko gore u Jankove dvore. Da im Janko podrezuje perje. Poreza se po desnici ruci. Pita njega ostarjela majka. Sine Janko, boli li te jako? Mila majko, ne boli me jako, što sam desno lijevom porezao, nek me boli i srce i duša za Turkinjom lijepom djevojkom. So this oral poem is significant linguistically because it is one of the best examples of the Yaakovian pronunciation in Croatian oral literature, and because of its linguistic significance, it is cited very frequently in Croatian grammars. So that was my presentation.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's impressive, definitely. However, I don't think that knowing who transferred knowledge to who guarantees that oral tradition is kept by letter, accurate by letter. I cannot see that, but okay. People are free to believe whatever they believe. So, do you think that oral tradition, knowing who is transferring knowledge to whom, is guaranteed that the same oral tradition was spoken 1,000 years ago, like it's been spoken now?
Well, I can't guarantee very many things in life, but it certainly raises the credibility of the oral tradition beyond just folk tales and some mythology. It also, of course, depends on what the oral tradition leads back to. Does it lead back to a public national revelation, or does it lead? It also depends on who started this oral tradition, right? So does it lead back to a public national revelation like the Jewish tradition does, or does it lead back to a man alone in a cave like some other religions have their traditions, right? So that also influences the credibility of the tradition.
Yeah, definitely. I agree with you, but as I said, since it's as you said yourself that many things are not written in Torah. Without oral tradition, Torah would be nothing. I mean, cannot be consumed at all. So that's very big importance, of course.
Yes, exactly, and many people don't understand the extent of the ambiguity of the written Hebrew text in the Torah. Before this discussion, you mentioned another language to me, which also has ambiguous words. But I think, on the top of my head, I think the Hebrew word Elohim in the written Torah has maybe 5, 6, or 7 different meanings, right? It is incredibly ambiguous. And the only way to know the specific meaning in context is through the oral Torah. Likewise, the word ger in the Pentateuch is also incredibly ambiguous. It can mean, outside the Torah law context, it can mean someone who is a stranger, a foreigner. In a Torah law context, it can mean a Jewish, a convert to Judaism, or it can also mean a Gentile who resides in the biblical land of Israel. So it is incredibly ambiguous, and this is why I believe the Protestant doctrine of sola scriptura is absolutely historically illiterate. It is absolutely historically illiterate, and I think it's not a coincidence that Protestantism developed with the development of the printing press. So before the printing press, there was no Protestantism, because they have no historical memory of when manuscripts had to be written and copied by hand. They underestimate the importance of oral traditions guiding the way how those manuscripts were written. I think that's a tragic flaw in the Protestant theology. And whenever I discuss with Protestants and other deniers of the Jewish oral Torah, I never received a convincing. I never received a convincing argument from them why following only the Hebrew text would be possible and feasible. And ironically, because the Jewish oral Torah explains the vowels and the punctuation in the Hebrew text, their own translations, so their English translations, which they use in those discussions, rely ironically and entirely on the Jewish oral Torah they deny. So that's incredibly ironic to me. Their own translations rely on the Jewish oral Torah and on its vowels and specific punctuations, which enable any translation at all. So they use the Jewish oral Torah indirectly through their translations, and then when they get the finished translation, they say they don't actually need the oral Torah, and they never actually needed the oral Torah. It's incredibly ironic to me.
Yeah, it's interesting, definitely. Yeah.
Okay, Mario. Thank you for discussing this with me.
Likewise, thank you, and have a great afternoon. I'm still in the night, so yeah, see you next time.
We are Godless Judaism.
We discuss atheism, religion, and everything else.